The P-47 Thunderbolt, from flying milk bottle to instrument of annihilation. April 8, 1943, 27,000 feet above Caen, France. The air at this altitude cuts like broken glass, so cold it burns exposed skin, so thin that every breath requires conscious effort. Through the crystal-clear canopy of his Focke-Wulf 190A5, Oberleut Hermeken studies the silhouettes climbing laboriously toward his formation. The veteran ace of Jagdgeschwader 26 can't suppress the smirk spreading across his oxygen-masked face. Below him, struggling upward through the thin air like drowning swimmers fighting toward the surface, 16 massive American fighters claw for altitude. "The Americans have sent us flying milk bottles," Hermeken transmits to his wingman, laughter crackling through the radio. The comparison seems apt. These new American machines appear almost comically oversized, their barrel-shaped fuselages topped with greenhouse canopies that catch the morning sun, wings that seem absurdly small for their massive bodies, propellers that dwarf anything in the Luftwaffe inventory. To German pilots accustomed to the sleek lines of Spitfires and the nimble Soviet fighters they've faced over countless battlefields, these corpulent American machines look like someone's cruel joke about what a fighter should be. The 16 Republic P-47C Thunderbolts of the 4th Fighter Group lumber upward in tight formation, their 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engines straining against their 7-ton weight. Each aircraft weighs as much as some twin-engine fighters. Their pilots, most of them former RAF Eagle Squadron veterans who've recently transferred from nimble Spitfires, are still learning the peculiarities of this heavyweight American mount. Inside those cramped cockpits, hearts pound not just from exertion, but from the primal fear that comes with combat debut. They're flying an untested machine against the most experienced fighter force in the world. What Hermeken doesn't know, what none of the German pilots circling like wolves above could possibly imagine, is that they're witnessing the arrival of the weapon that will systematically dismantle the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. Within 18 months, these flying milk bottles will transform from objects of derision into instruments of terror. Those 8 50-caliber Browning machine guns mounted in the Thunderbolt's broad wings will become the most feared sound in German skies. The mathematics of destruction are already loaded in those wings. 3,400 rounds of ammunition, a combined rate of fire of 6,000 rounds per minute, enough concentrated firepower to saw a Messerschmitt in half in less than 2 seconds. Major Donald Blakesley, commanding the 335th Fighter Squadron, spots the German formation positioning for attack. The former Eagle Squadron veteran understands something his men haven't yet grasped, something that goes against every instinct they've developed flying Spitfires. Survival in the P-47 requires abandoning every conventional fighter doctrine has taught them. The Thunderbolt isn't meant to turn with German fighters or climb with them at medium altitudes. It's something entirely different, a weapon designed around principles that European air forces haven't yet conceived. The German formation rolls into their attack, confident, practiced, lethal. They've done this hundreds of times against British, Soviet, and now American aircraft. Their tactics are refined through years of combat. Their pilots, veterans of multiple campaigns. Some have flown since Poland in 1939, survived the Battle of Britain, fought through Russia's brutal skies. They know their aircraft intimately, understand their capabilities and limitations, and they've already sized up these new American opponents as easy prey. But something happens in the first engagement that plants a seed in German minds, though they won't recognize it immediately. The P-47s don't disintegrate under fire the way other fighters do. Cannon shells that should shred control surfaces punch through, and the Thunderbolts keep flying. Machine gun bursts that would have sent a Messerschmitt spinning earthward merely dent the heavy American machines. One P-47 takes multiple hits from a Focke-Wulf's 20mm cannons and actually accelerates away in a dive that leaves its pursuer helplessly behind, the German fighter unable to match that terrifying descent speed. The Americans lose aircraft in this first engagement. Men die, but something unprecedented also occurs. Some of the damaged Thunderbolts, aircraft that by all rights should be falling as burning wreckage, continue flying. They limp home across the channel with damage that would have destroyed 3 conventional fighters. Their pilots arrive at English bases shaking, adrenaline-shocked, but alive. Ground crews swarm the returned aircraft and stop counting bullet holes after reaching numbers that should have been fatal. This is the moment, though no one yet realizes it, when the balance of air power in Europe begins to shift. Not because the P-47 is more maneuverable than German fighters. It isn't. Not because it climbs better at low altitude. It doesn't. But because it represents something fundamentally different in fighter design philosophy, something that will change the nature of aerial warfare itself. The Thunderbolt embodies American industrial logic applied to combat. Where European designers pursued lightweight interceptors optimized for climb and turn performance, Republic Aviation created a high-altitude juggernaut that uses mass, power, and overwhelming firepower to redefine what's possible in the sky. It's a fighter designed by engineers who understood that in modern warfare, survivability and hitting power matter more than traditional agility metrics. It's built by a nation with resources to spare, designed for pilots who will receive more training than their enemies, maintained by ground crews who have unlimited spare parts. Among the 56 American pilots spread across the French sky that morning are men who will become legends, future aces whose names will strike fear into Luftwaffe hearts. But on April 8, 1943, they're novices in an untested machine, facing veterans who've been fighting continuously since the invasion of Poland. The Germans have 4 years of combat experience. The Americans have exactly 0 days. This is the story of how that equation reversed itself. How industrial logic defeated tactical brilliance. How quantity and quality merged into overwhelming superiority. How German pilots' laughter turned to terror as they discovered what synchronized Browning machine guns
could do to an aircraft at 400 yards. It's the story of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the flying milk bottle that became the hammer that shattered German air power. The genesis of Thunder, building a monster. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt emerged not from careful peacetime planning, but from June 1940 panic. German fighters were sweeping across France with terrifying efficiency, destroying the aircraft of multiple nations, establishing air superiority wherever they appeared. In offices across America, military planners scrambled to understand how the United States might compete with the Luftwaffe's proven superiority. The answers they developed would challenge every assumption about fighter design. Alexander Kartveli, Republic Aviation's Georgian-born chief designer, received urgent specifications from the U.S. Army Air Corps. They wanted a high-altitude interceptor capable of matching the Luftwaffe's best fighters. What Kartveli designed instead was something that defied conventional wisdom, a machine so massive that it seemed to violate the basic principles of fighter aircraft design. He understood something that European designers had missed. At the altitudes where future air battles would be fought, above 25,000 feet, where bomber formations would cruise, a different kind of fighter was needed. It will be a dinosaur, Kartveli admitted to his design team during the early planning stages, but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions. This wasn't false modesty. The aircraft taking shape on his drawing boards dwarfed every fighter design in production. But Kartveli had calculated something crucial. If you could get enough power at altitude, if you could build the structure strong enough to withstand tremendous forces, if you could arm the thing heavily enough, mass became an advantage rather than a liability. The XP-47B prototype that first flew on May 6, 1941, shocked everyone who saw it. At 9,900 pounds empty, it weighed 65% more than its predecessor, the P-43 Lancer. Setting it beside a Spitfire or Messerschmitter made the comparison almost comical. The British fighter looked like a graceful rapier. The German machine resembled a precision scalpel. The Thunderbolt looked like someone had decided to build a fighter around a small locomotive. The massive turbo supercharger system, with its complex ducting running through the rear fuselage, gave the P-47 an almost pregnant appearance. The system was engineering marvel and packaging nightmare combined. Exhaust gases from the enormous radial engine drove a turbine that compressed intake air, feeding it back to the engine. This allowed the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP to maintain sea-level power output at altitudes where conventional engines gasped for oxygen. But the ducting required to make this work snaked throughout the rear fuselage, adding complexity, weight, and vulnerability. Test pilots approaching the Thunderbolt for the first time invariably asked the same question, delivered with varying degrees of disbelief and concern. This thing actually flies? The skepticism was understandable. The cockpit sat far forward on the fuselage, giving pilots the impression they were perched on the nose of a small bomber. The wings, though broad, seemed inadequate for the massive fuselage they supported. The tail looked like it had been borrowed from a larger aircraft. Every proportion seemed wrong by conventional fighter standards. But it flew. Not only did it fly, it flew like nothing else at altitude. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP, an 18-cylinder radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower, maintained full power at 27,000 feet, where German fighters struggled. The turbo supercharger system, fed by exhaust gases, delivered sea-level performance in the stratosphere, where the air was too thin for conventional superchargers to function effectively. Above 25,000 feet, the Thunderbolt had performance advantages that would prove decisive. Major Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, training at Bridgeport, Connecticut, initially despised the aircraft assigned to his unit. His feelings were justified by tragic experience. Between September 1942 and January 1943, his unit lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training accidents. The P-47 killed more Americans in training than Germans would in the first months of combat. This wasn't incompetence. The P-47 was simply a difficult machine to master, with characteristics that punished mistakes instantly. It ground-looped on landing, the massive engine torque and tailwheel configuration making it want to swap ends during rollout. Pilots who relaxed concentration on the runway found themselves careening across grass, often ending with crumpled wingtips or collapsed landing gear. It torque rolled on takeoff, that enormous propeller generating forces that wanted to flip the aircraft onto its back if pilots didn't apply massive right rudder during the initial climb. And it dove with such enthusiasm that pilots discovered compressibility, their controls freezing as shock waves formed on the wings when approaching the speed of sound. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma who would become one of America's top aces with 27 victories, described his first flight in terms that captured both the terror and exhilaration. It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive. The power was unbelievable. You didn't fly it, you aimed it. Point the nose where you want to go and hang on. Everything happened fast, faster than any airplane I'd flown. But once you understood it, once you stopped trying to make it do what other fighters did and started using what it could do that they couldn't, you realized you were sitting in something extraordinary. Those who mastered the Thunderbolt discovered an aircraft with capabilities that redefined what fighters could do. In a dive from altitude, nothing could catch it. The massive weight that hindered climb performance became devastating momentum when pointed earthward. From 30,000 feet, a P-47 could reach 550 miles per hour, faster than any German fighter could achieve even in a vertical dive. This speed could be converted to altitude in a zoom climb that left pursuing fighters helplessly behind, their engines starving for oxygen as they watched the American fighter soar beyond reach. The cockpit, once pilots adjusted to its location far forward on the fuselage, offered visibility that German pilots would envy. The greenhouse canopy provided views in nearly every direction. The instruments were logically arranged, clearly marked, easy to read even in combat's chaos. The radios actually worked,
unlike the temperamental systems that plagued many fighters. The heating system functioned at altitude where other fighters left their pilots freezing. These weren't glamorous features, but they mattered enormously during 4-hour missions at 30,000 feet.
With the training accidents continued, a grim reminder that the Thunderbolt demanded respect and skill. Pilots who tried to dogfight at low altitude found themselves in unrecoverable spins. Those who forgot the aircraft's weight during landing approached too fast and ran out of runway. Men who let their attention wander during takeoff found themselves inverted, watching the ground approach from a perspective that left no time for recovery. Each accident taught survivors crucial lessons, but the learning curve was steep and the failures were often fatal. By early 1943, as the 56th Fighter Group prepared for deployment to England, Zemke had developed a cadre of pilots who understood the P-47's unique characteristics. They knew to keep their speed up, to fight in the vertical rather than the horizontal, to use their weight and power rather than trying to outturn opponents. They understood that the Thunderbolt wasn't a Spitfire or a Messerschmitt. It was something new, something that required abandoning conventional fighter tactics and developing new ones suited to its capabilities. The aircraft they took to war was a machine of contradictions. It was the heaviest single-engine fighter in service, yet it could reach altitudes where lighter fighters couldn't function. It appeared ungainly on the ground, but in its element high above the earth, it became a predator of devastating efficiency. It seemed to violate every principle of fighter design, yet it would prove more effective than fighters that followed conventional wisdom. The P-47 was American engineering at its most pragmatic. If you need more power, install a bigger engine. If you need more firepower, add more guns. If you need more protection, add more armor. Make it strong enough to handle the forces involved, and damn the weight penalties. The armament represented American firepower philosophy perfectly. 8 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 4 in each wing, each with 425 rounds. European fighters typically carried 4 guns with limited ammunition. German fighters mounted cannons that hit harder individually, but carried perhaps 150 rounds total. The P-47's 850 calibers could maintain sustained fire for over 30 seconds, an eternity in aerial combat. At convergence distance, typically set at 300 yards, all 8 guns' ballistic paths intersected in a zone roughly 6 feet in diameter. Anything entering that zone faced 100 projectiles per second, each traveling at 2,900 feet per second. The ammunition itself was a revelation of American industrial capacity. While German fighters struggled with limited cannon ammunition, American pilots could hold the trigger down and watch tracers stream toward their target. The standard combat load mixed armor-piercing incendiary, armor-piercing incendiary tracer, and standard ball ammunition in patterns designed to both destroy and ignite. Each projectile weighed nearly 2 ounces. Together, those 8 guns hurled almost 12 pounds of metal per second at the enemy. The structural strength was almost absurd by European standards. The wing spars could support 40,000 pounds, 3 times the aircraft's loaded weight. The engine mount could withstand 12 G-forces. The control cables were doubled throughout with automatic backup systems. Everything was over-engineered, built to survive damage that would destroy conventional fighters. This wasn't elegant engineering. It was brute force design, backed by unlimited aluminum and an industrial base that could afford to make everything stronger than necessary. Behind the pilot sat a 3/8-inch steel armor plate and a 1/2-inch bulletproof glass windscreen. Armor deflection plates surrounded the engine. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, containing multiple layers that swelled when punctured to prevent fuel loss. The radial engine, unlike the liquid-cooled inline engines that German and British fighters used, could absorb incredible damage and continue running. There was no vulnerable coolant system to puncture. Cylinder banks could be shot away, and the remaining cylinders would continue functioning. It was an engine that refused to quit. As the first P-47 units prepared to deploy to England in late 1942 and early 1943, debates raged about whether the aircraft would prove effective in combat.
British observers, noting its size and weight, quietly suggested the Americans might reconsider their choice. RAF pilots who'd fought the Luftwaffe for 3 years joked that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 is to unstrap and run around the roomy cockpit. German intelligence, receiving reports about the new American fighter, noted its specifications with interest, but not concern. It appeared to confirm their assessment that Americans didn't understand modern air combat. The stage was set. American pilots trained in an aircraft their allies doubted and their enemies mocked. The P-47 Thunderbolt was about to enter combat in the most hostile skies on Earth, facing the most experienced fighter force in history. What happened next would transform aerial warfare and ultimately help destroy German air power. But first, the Americans would have to survive their baptism of fire. Baptism in blood, first combat and hard lessons. The first combat encounters in April and May 1943 confirmed every German prejudice about American fighter design. The P-47s couldn't turn with the FW-190s, couldn't climb with the Messerschmitt 110s, couldn't match their nimble handling at medium altitudes where most dogfights occurred. German fighter pilots quickly developed tactics to exploit these weaknesses. They attacked from below where the heavy Thunderbolts struggled. They forced turning fights, where agility mattered more than firepower. They climbed away after attacks, knowing the P-47s couldn't follow effectively at lower altitudes. Hauptmann Josef Peps Priller, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader 26, reported to headquarters after his first encounter with the new American fighter. His assessment dripped with contempt born of easy victories. The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter. It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow. Our boys are calling them Indianer, fat targets pretending to be warriors. If this is what American industry produces, the war is already won.
The statistics from those early weeks seemed to confirm German confidence. In their first month of operations, the American fighter groups lost 14 Thunderbolts for only 3 confirmed German kills. The exchange ratio was disastrous. At this rate, the Luftwaffe would bleed the American fighter force white long before escorts could protect the bomber streams that were beginning to pound German industry. German pilots competed for kills against the new American fighters, considering them easier prey than the nimble Spitfires they'd learned to respect. But something strange was happening beneath the surface of these engagements, something German intelligence failed to notice or properly assess. The P-47s that were shot down had absorbed incredible punishment before falling. Aircraft were returning from missions with damage that should have been instantly fatal. One Thunderbolt came back from a May 4th mission with 21 cannon holes and over 100 machine gun strikes. The pilot walked away from an aircraft that looked like it had been through a metal shredder. This was damage that would have disintegrated a Messerschmitt or Spitfire into falling debris. More significantly, when P-47s did get their guns on target, the results were catastrophic. The convergence zone created by 8 synchronized 50 caliber machine guns produced destruction that German pilots had never experienced. Unlike the rifle caliber weapons of early war fighters or cannons with limited ammunition, the American fighter could maintain sustained fire for over 30 seconds. In dogfight timescales, this was an eternity. German pilots began reporting fighters that simply held the trigger down, pouring streams of heavy bullets that dismantled aircraft piece by piece. The event that would begin changing German perceptions occurred on June 26, 1943, over Forges-les-Eaux in northern France. It involved 2nd Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron and an encounter that would become legendary on both sides of the conflict. The mission started routinely. Johnson's formation of 8 P-47s was returning from escort duty when they were bounced by 16 Focke-Wulf 190s from Jagdgeschwader 26, led by Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, younger brother of the famous Adolf Galland. The Germans executed a perfect attack, diving from the sun with overwhelming speed advantage. Their timing was flawless, their positioning ideal. Johnson's Thunderbolt, flying at the rear of the formation, was caught in the crossfire of multiple attackers. In the first seconds of combat, before he could even react, his aircraft took catastrophic damage.
21 20mm cannon shells exploded across his aircraft in a sequence of devastating impacts. The canopy shattered, sending plexiglass fragments through the cockpit like crystalline shrapnel. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the instrument panel, obscuring critical gauges. The engine cowling was torn away, pieces of it tumbling through the air behind him. Fire erupted behind the instrument panel, flames licking at his feet. Johnson, wounded in the nose and leg by shrapnel and bullet fragments, tried to bail out. Standard procedure when your aircraft was this badly damaged dictated immediate egress. But he discovered in those terrifying seconds that the canopy was jammed. A 20mm shell had exploded in the canopy track, welding the metal together. He was trapped in a dying aircraft at 27,000 feet, flames spreading, controls barely responding, engine shaking itself apart. What happened next defied every assumption about combat damage tolerance that German pilots had developed through years of experience. Despite having no forward visibility through the oil-covered windscreen, despite a barely functioning engine that shook violently enough to blur his vision, despite controls that responded only intermittently and then sluggishly, Johnson managed to level the aircraft and point it toward England. The P-47 continued flying with damage that would have reduced any other fighter to falling debris. Then it got worse. A lone Focke-Wulf 190, flown by an unknown pilot from Jagdgeschwader 26, discovered the crippled Thunderbolt limping toward the channel at less than 170 miles per hour. Historical research has never definitively identified this pilot, though several names have been proposed based on German combat reports from that day. What followed was one of the most extraordinary encounters in aerial warfare history, one that would be retold in ready rooms and documented in official histories, one that would fundamentally change how both sides viewed the Thunderbolt. The German pilot positioned himself behind Johnson's P-47 with textbook precision. He opened fire with his 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns at optimal range. Johnson, unable to evade, unable even to see clearly what was happening behind him, could only huddle behind his armor plate and pray. The Thunderbolt absorbed the entire cannon ammunition load. Shells exploded along the fuselage, blasting metal fragments in every direction. The tail was shredded, the wings were perforated. The rear fuselage looked like someone had attacked it with a sledgehammer. Still, it flew. The German pilot repositioned, perhaps unable to believe what he was seeing. He fired again, this time only with his machine guns, the cannon ammunition exhausted. The 13mm rounds, each nearly as large as a man's thumb, punched through aluminum, through structure, through systems. They should have been fatal. The Thunderbolt continued flying, its massive radial engine refusing to quit despite taking direct hits, its redundant control systems maintaining just enough authority to keep it airborne. The German pilot pulled alongside, close enough that Johnson could see his face through his shattered canopy. The German was young, blonde, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion to something approaching fear or awe. He stared at the wreckage that somehow still flew, at the American pilot visible through the destroyed canopy, at an aircraft that, by all logic and experience, should have been falling as burning fragments. The German pilot shook his head slowly, gave what witnesses described as an informal salute, and peeled away. Johnson's P-47 landed at Manston, its engine failing as the wheels touched the runway. The landing gear held despite multiple hits to the hydraulic system. The brakes functioned despite damaged lines. The airframe held together despite structural members that had been shot through. The crew chief began counting bullet holes and stopped after reaching 200, realizing that cataloging every hit would take days. One cannon shell had exploded inches from Johnson's head. Another had detonated directly against the armor plate behind his seat, the plate that had saved his life. The engine had taken direct hits to multiple cylinder banks. The control cables were partially severed. 3 of the 4 main longerons, the structural backbone of the fuselage, were shot through. Yet the aircraft had brought him home across 150 miles of hostile territory and open water. It had flown with one wing partially separated from the fuselage. It had maintained control with cables hanging by threads. It had continued generating power with an engine that looked like it had been attacked with an axe. This wasn't luck. This was engineering,
American over-engineering that built everything 3 times stronger than necessary, that added redundancy upon redundancy, that assumed catastrophic damage and designed systems to function anyway.